Okay. All right. Folks, I'm going to stop sharing for a moment so I can greet everybody. Hello, everybody. So I want to welcome everybody to this event. I'm still admitting some people as they arrive. My name is Neville Swade, and I am the director of the Access Program. I have scheduled to have my colleague from the Department of Science and Innovation, who really is our liaison person in the Department of Science and Innovation, say a few words of welcome, but he's having trouble connecting. So we are going to proceed without his words of introduction, and I'll use those moments just to add a bit of background for you. So I'm really excited and grateful for this day that arrived. Been planning now for a couple of months, and this particular meeting for about a month, and really grateful to our speakers who I will introduce in a moment. So I thought I'll go back to my slides quickly and just give you a little bit of context about this idea and what we're all about. So you should be able to see a couple of slides here with just a couple of notes that I wanted to share with you. And as I said, my colleague Leduma is unable to join us, but I'll just take his place. What I want to say is that Access is a program which is run by the Department of Science and Innovation and the National Research Foundation. It's part of what's called the Global Change Research Program. And I am the director of the Access Program, which is a research program which is focused on climate and earth sciences. I have the responsibility of not only organizing the research that goes into earth science program, but also to develop what we are calling a functional climate change research network. And that research obviously extends beyond the physical and natural sciences and also the social sciences. That's what the Global Change Program is about. And we felt that there is a missing platform, and in particular, a platform to really get into some of the depths and technicalities of some transboundary, transdisciplinary issues around climate change, and hence this particular program. And so we thought we'd kick off with something which is broadly interesting to a lot of different disciplines, in particular the policy and legal aspects of climate change, and in South Africa in particular. And since there's been some news recently about the establishment of the Presidential Commission, for example, felt that it was necessary for kind of provide an opportunity for some investigation of this landscape and understanding of it. So I've got three really great guests today. So I will go into that in a short moment. I just want to say thank you for registering and participating in this event, and thanks for the many great ideas that I've received so far from several of our registrants, which we will definitely take up. We are planning to do 2 or 3 more this year, and I'm going to advertise them now. And the one is to look at the California and Australian and South African wildfire intensification. So these are big global events that seem to be ubiquitous, and to ask the question, what is the attribution, and how do we unpack attribution? How much of this can we attribute to what is by some to be forest management problem, and others to be solely climate change driven problem? And so we need to look into those really big events that are happening globally. They may be remote, but they matter to us, and this is what we want to try to get into. Another example, that of the Greenland and Arctic ice melt. which is really reaching significant proportion, and really to understand those trends and those cycles and those attributions and what the implications are. And then the third one we're looking at will be in respect of the recent global biodiversity reports and the African contribution to those. And so a broad range of topics from around the world, and we'll have the right experts to those for us. So that's really what we're all about, and I will not talk any longer, but welcome you one more time that have just joined us, and say that really grateful for you to join us and to our speakers. So we'll move now to the main event, and as you all know, we have distinguished speakers who will give us some inputs, and then we will open the opportunity for some comments and queries, which will take place later. And my colleague, Oscar Mokotedi, will be managing that side of things. There's a chat box for you to pop in your questions and queries, and so we will proceed from there. So we'll start with Tlou, who will deal with the policy aspects, Andrew, who will look at some of the legal structures, and Marcia, who will deal specifically with some of the legislation. So now I'm going to introduce you to Tlou, but to do that, I have to just tell you something about him. And for those of you that don't know, he is the Chief Director in the Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries, in the Directorate of Climate Change Adaptation, and is responsible for climate change adaptation planning in South Africa. He has been instrumental in the development of the National Climate Change Adaptation Strategy and the Climate Change Bill, and he further serves on the GCF board, and he's going to tell you what the GCF board is, because I don't know. I think it's a Green Climate Fund. So Tlou, over to you, please. And I have your slides. I'll bring you to your first slide, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Neville, and good afternoon, colleagues. And Neville, you know what GCF is. You were spot on. It's the Green Climate Fund. But firstly, let me thank you for organizing this session. I think it is timely. It is required that we time and again have these discussions to deal with these very serious issues that are rather complex and multidisciplinary, as you have indicated. Thank you for inviting us. And good afternoon, colleagues. I think I'll just go straight into the presentation. Neville, are you controlling from your side? You will go to the next slide. And my presentation, in essence, is just to share with you the climate change policy. But in that process, I also wanted to outline to you in terms of what science is saying, because we have scientific work that underpin the development of the policy. In terms of this climate scientific work, we already seen that there are observed trends, and there are also projections that tells us what the future will look like. On the observed trend, I think what has been observed is high annual temperatures with very extreme temperatures that are in the increase, and whereas there is also a frequency on the low annual temperatures. And we also observe that in terms of the rainfall, on the precipitation, we experiencing some below average rainfall, particularly from 1960 to the early 2000. And we also observe that there's an increase, in as much as these are below average, there's an increase in terms of the intensity of this rainfall. And you find that you'll have a rainfall below average, but within a short space of time, the intensity is high. And you start experiencing things like flooding and so forth. On the projections, I think there are two elements. One is projection carried out under the low mitigations, where you also starting to see an increase in temperature of around 4 degrees Celsius, and where there is, of course, high mitigation scenarios, we're seeing the increased temperature of between 2.5 to 4 degrees Celsius. So in essence, what we are seeing from the projection side is the temperature are increasing. There is a high increase of temperatures that is around 4 degrees, and I think it is way above the global projections that we are seeing, particularly for the southern region. On the precipitation, of course, we are seeing more, there's an uncertainty in terms of the projections for rainfall projections. And we also we're seeing a projections under the low mitigation where we start to experience drier conditions. And this, of course, will come with the drought spell, and which we have started experiencing, be it in the Western Cape, be it in the Eastern Cape, be it in the Northern Cape, and some of these provinces are still struggling to really come out of the grip of drought. So in general, these extreme weather events such as drought, flooding, extreme storms, and the fires, if one can mention the Knysna fires, are becoming some of the things that really requires our attention. And with these projections, there is, of course, an increase in terms of their frequency, and there's an increase in terms of their intensity. So science is telling us that obviously there is an impact of climate change that we really need to respond to. If you go to the next slide, Neville. Thank you so much. And I've just sketched a little bit in terms of the process for developing the climate change policy, just to go back to the archives and say what the process looked like. In terms of this development of the policy, I think the starting point was really to develop what we call the climate change response strategy then in 2004. And the focus really was to respond to the international obligation. As you know, we're party to the we are party to the UNFCCC. This is the United Nations Framework on Climate Change. We're party to the Kyoto Protocol, currently party to the Paris Agreement. So the starting point was to come up with a strategy that will enable us to respond to those international obligations. And in 2005, we had a National Climate Change Conference, brought all stakeholders together. And it is in this conference that there was a mandate mooted for the development of the climate change policy. And this was largely followed by an intensive research work on the long-term mitigation scenario work, which started to inform us to say, if we are to really address climate change, what are the scenarios, what are some of the paths that we have to take? And this informed what we call the South African mitigation trajectory. Some know it as the PPD. And in 2008, that is when Cabinet approved clearly the process of developing the policy, where the department then was able to develop a green paper. And in 2011, we then had the National Climate Change Response Policy, which is known as the white paper. And this has become the policy that is guiding us in terms of our response. Next slide, Neville. In terms of the policy itself, I thought I should just share this, and I know colleagues, those who are working in the space are versed with this, to say the vision really is to transition to a lower carbon and climate resilient society. And it has two objectives. One is to mitigate against climate change impact through interventions that will build both the social, economic, and environmental resilience, and enable us in terms of the capacity to respond, which is largely on the adaptation side of the policy. And we have on the mitigation component The policy's objective is to enable us to make our fair contribution to the global effort to stabilize the greenhouse gas emission concentration. And as I've already alluded to, we are party to the UNFCCC, we are party to the Paris Agreement. There are global goals in terms of reducing the emissions and in terms of adapting to climate change. So the policy help us to, as a country, to make our fair contribution to the attainment of those goals. And strategic approach, I think we focus in terms of developmental agenda. We ensure that it was transformational and it participatory in nature. It was need-driven, customized. It was evidence-based, as I've already alluded to some of the research work that underpin the development of the policy. Next slide, Neville. Well, in terms of the overarching strategic priorities for the policy, I think it was underpinned around risk reduction and management, and particularly to enable us to prioritize adaptation. And it was the so look in terms of which activities, which action can give us significant output and outcome in terms of the reduction of emission, policy and regulatory alignment. I mean, these are multidisciplinary work which will require us to ensure that there is policy alignment across different sectors. And of course, it was also prioritizing technology research, development, and innovation to ensure that we're able to promote research and, of course, acquisition of adaptation technologies. And one of the key elements was to facilitate behavioral change through the use of incentive and disincentives. And some, of course, will be inclusive of the carbon tax. And I think as we go along, there will be some element that will be shared around that. Behavioral change through education, training, and awareness being one of the key components. But again, resource mobilization, as we know that for us to really transit to the low carbon trajectory will require resources to support that transition, and integrated planning where the focus is around mainstreaming of climate change into the planning regimes and planning frameworks, where we have worked with the provinces, we have worked with the sectors at national level to ensure that they start mainstreaming climate change, energy, water, agriculture, human settlement, to mention but few. But the last one is really to ensure that we have informed decision making and planning, whereby the whole element of early warning system becomes central. The climate information becomes critical for an informed decision making and planning. The next slide. On this slide, I just wanted to outline the planning process for adaptation component of the policy, where of course it was largely informed by the long-term adaptation scenario, which was of course the scenario work that was undertaken to look what are the likely impact associated with the various projected climate change. And we also did the impact analysis of the various sectors: water, agriculture, forestry, health, marine fisheries, human settlement, disaster risk reduction and management. And of course, we looked in terms of the policy alignment. The policy pushed us to ensure that there is alignment, both at the sectoral level, provincial level, and ensure that we are able to develop the national adaptation strategy, mapping the vulnerability assessment, developing the climate service framework, which I will also deal with, and of course, deal with the implementation of projects that will start to enable the various stakeholders, both in government, civil society, private sector, to work together to implement climate change adaptation responses. The next slide. With the adoption and the implementation of the climate change policy, it culminated to the development of a national climate change adaptation strategy. And this is one of the key documents that aim to coordinate adaptation responses across the country with participation of civil society, private sector, academia, government. And within this strategy, we have 9 interventions, which are strategic interventions that will focus on reducing human and economic, environmental, and physical infrastructure, enabling us to coordinate climate services, ensuring that you have all these climate services colleagues that are working in the space to ensure that there is access to climate information for public good as one of the priority, develop the vulnerability and resilient framework, which enable in essence for the different sectors to undertake risk and vulnerability that will enable aggregation, so that if you take the risk and vulnerability of a province in Northwest or a province in Limpopo or Northern Cape, you are at a national level, you are able to aggregate and have a broader picture. And of course, the fourth one is to facilitate mainstreaming. Mainstreaming becomes one of the important elements of responding to climate change, particularly on adaptation. And we also have a focus area around promotion of research, which becomes a critical element for us to continue to ensure that we are evidence-based, increase the knowledge generation, and enable planning and implementation that is supported by evidence, and to also build the necessary capacity and awareness across the country to can be able to respond. And in this context, we have the Let's Response Toolkit, which is a tool that we have used to capacitate the districts, municipalities, to integrate climate change into their planning tools and planning processes, and of course to establish effective governance. And I think the climate change bill that is currently at NETLEC is aiming and doing that, and to also look in terms of enabling the financial flows to ensure that we are able to access finance for climate change, and to improve on the monitoring and evaluation system where we are able to track and be able to monitor the various interventions across the country. Next slide, I'll just quickly run fast, mindful of time, Neville, if you can just move quicker on the summary. And we also have the National Framework on Climate Services. And this framework in the main is aimed at bringing both the users and the information producers together to enable access to information, climate information, for planning purposes, but to also foster collaboration across the various users. And in this, of course, we're looking at the user interface platform, climate services information system. We have a system developed as far within the department, and we are able to interact with different users to ensure that we can facilitate access of various climate information products. Next slide.
Do you want me to just tell me which slide you want? I'll just move to the next one.
Okay, this is the next one. It's fine. Let me deal with the mitigation aspect of things, where the policy was very clear in terms of having the key elements around the mitigation system. One is the trajectory range, and known as the PPD, where we agree that we will peak by 2025, plateau by 2035, and start to see absolute decline in terms of the emission by 2035. And this also provides the governance that will include, among other things, what we call phase 1 of the mitigation system, but of course look into in terms of the mitigation potential analysis that has been undertaken for various sectors to determine which sectors can give us greater outcomes. But the carbon budget, where we allocate carbon budget, currently still voluntary, but of course allowing business to also develop the mitigation plans and improve on the PHG reporting system, where we are able to generate and track the emission over a period of time and understand where we are. and phase 2 were envisaged to start in 2021, but it's also dependent on the finalization of the climate change bill. Next slide. I think we're getting to the last slide. I'm mindful of time. And this is just a cycle of the mitigation phase 2, where we look at the potential analysis, developing the sectoral carbon budget and the sectoral emission targets by the sectors. And of course, it will all go through to the reporting systems where we are able to report and capture our emission through the GHG inventory. Next slide. We also have the low emission development strategy, which I'm not going to read word by word, but this in essence is starting to talk to the various interventions on mitigation measures, where we look in terms of the IRP, the biofuels, the solar water heaters, building standards, the industrial policy and action plans, the tax incentives, that all these measures are put together within the low emission development strategy approved by cabinet to help us to really address the emission. Next slide, Neville. And at the heart of this is around the move towards a just transition, where we have 3 phases. We have phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. And you could see that the phase 1, that's where we say, where do we start? We start with the vulnerability development of the sectoral job resilient plan. That of course is informed by the employment vulnerability assessment, and it will also enable us to develop approaches for the allocation of sectoral emission targets, and to also develop the monitoring plan. Phase 2, we're looking at turning the corner, where we're looking at the development of a detailed transformational plan for each sector through the sector resilient jobs plan. And we are looking also at the massive rollout of phase 3 to 2050, where these sectoral plans are implemented. Next slide, Neville. And this is the last slide, where we, of course, in terms of the Paris Agreement, we have to communicate our nationally determined contribution every 5 years. And we're currently working in terms of revising or updating our NDC that deals with both adaptation, mitigation, as well as the means of implementation. We've also developed the PAMS policy and measures, and we need to scale that up in terms of implementation. And the next slide, Neville, I think the last slide is really around just providing a summary of the work that has been done since 1997, from joining the United Nations and all the way in terms of what is contained in the policy on the PPD and the Let's Response Toolkit, and to where Neville was starting to touch around the development of the climate change bill, but also the development, the establishment of the Presidential Climate Change Coordination Commission, which is going to be the key body to manage and provide oversight on the just transition. And there's work underway to effect the cabinet approval on the establishment of the Presidential Climate Change Coordinating Commission. Thank you, Neville. I was just trying to rush. I'm mindful of time because I want to allow for full discussion. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much, Tlou. I think it's clear that it's an extremely complex landscape, and there's a lot of interest in it from our audience here. A lot of people wanted to see your slides, et cetera, which we will make available with your permission later on. I want to, for the sake of continuity, get through our other 2 contributions, because I think together they make a story. And we are collecting some questions in the chat box. If you do have some questions or comments which we can use, Oscar is busy collating those, and will give us some input if we have some time towards the end of the meeting. So I'm going to move on to Andrew next, who is going to pick up from where Tlou left off. Andrew was introduced to me a couple of weeks ago as our leading expert in climate change law as a legal practitioner. He's the director of Climate Legal and a specialist in climate change and carbon markets. He's a lawyer with 20 years of practical experience in these niche areas. Climate Legal was the external climate change legal counsel to the government on the climate change bill, and he has advised Thai, Zimbabwe, and Seychelles governments and SADC on climate governance matters. So extremely well qualified and very glad to have him. And I'm now going to hand the floor to you, please, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Neville. Can you hear me okay and see me okay?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. Thank you very much to Access for the opportunity, and great respect to Tlou for that presentation. Trying to summarize an incredibly complex area in 20 minutes. So I'm going to take a very lawyerly approach in that I'd like to demonstrate some of the microcosm, if you like, some of the component parts of various of the policies and the policy directions that Tlou has set out for us. And I have 3 slides. I'm going to talk firstly about the climate change bill, and I'm going to link that to what the Department's Environmental Affairs has created as a mitigation system going forward. The reason I'd like to talk about that is because it is the primary set of instruments through which private sector is going to be encouraged, let's use that word, to contribute to the national climate change response, particularly as far as mitigation goes. And then in my final slide, I'd like to try and draw some of these threads together. So let me give you a sense of this. So we have a climate change bill, which was gazetted in July 2018. It's a very interesting instrument because unlike a number of other international or domestic legislation in other jurisdictions, it doesn't only focus on mitigation. It has in equal measure sections that deal with mitigation and adaptation, but a range of other very important aspects of the mechanisms of implementation of a climate change response, including, as an example, what Neville, you've referred to and Tlou's referred to as the Presidential Climate Change Consultative Committee, or in business speak, the P4C. Now, the slide you have before you is representative of the climate change bill as gazetted in July 2018. I say that because it's quite important to understand that, as we are beginning to realize, the bill as it existed 2 years ago is evolving during the course of negotiations between government and civil society, and less so civil society, but more industry formations at the NEDLAC level. So I'm putting this slide up not as representative of what the bill does now. We are still waiting to see what the revised bill would look like. But I'm putting this up
We seem to have lost Andrew. Wait, are you back, Andrew? We lost you for a short time.
I'm back. Apologies.
Okay, great. You can pick up where you left off.
It's one of the burdens of living on the KwaZulu-Natal North Coast. The Wi-Fi is not always that great, but the weather's fine. The point I was making is that what this slide seeks to do is to illustrate that the bill, which is a national statute or will become a national statute, quite correctly deals with interventions at national, municipal, and provincial level. It talks to interventions within sectoral departments within government, and then it also speaks to the responsibilities that will need to be shouldered by the private sector. So for me, what this image indicates is that really interesting interconnectedness of a national climate change response. I'm very interested to see some of the questions that are being asked. I mean, there's a question being posed whether perhaps more desirable than one that might be the result of piecemeal strategies across government. And it's worth saying that it needs to be all of those things within the context of our constitution. And so, Oscar, I'd very much like us to revisit that question a little bit later. You'll see it was asked by Dalit. I'd be very interested to examine that. But the point about this slide is that it is giving us a flavor of the range of responsibilities across the society that will need to be focused on a proper response to climate change. Now, having said that, I'd like to give a more particular view of what government is thinking about in the context of mitigation, and in particular, regulatory and legislative interventions around mitigation. So if you'll go to the next slide, please, Neville. So Tlou mentioned the 2011 National Climate Change Response Policy, which has been around for a while, clearly nearly a decade. And that policy, notwithstanding the fact that it has seen some development and elaboration over time, still pretty much reflects the building blocks or the components, if you like, of what government calls the post-2020 mitigation system. So that's what this slide tries to summarize. So down the left-hand slide, you've got a series of instruments. There are 6 of them. 3 of them I've highlighted in red because I'm going to discuss those in slightly more detail and refer to them in the next slide. But let's think about what it is that the future of mitigation governance is going to look like in the country. First of all, it's going to be determined by the national greenhouse gas emissions trajectory, which in terms of the Climate Change Bill, the Future Act, will be determined, must be determined, so it is imperative on the Environment Minister to determine that trajectory on a that what Tlou referred to as the peak, plateau, and decline. Have you lost me?
We lost you last sentence.
My apologies.
Important sentence.
I'll go back to that. It's quite likely that our first national greenhouse gas emissions trajectory will be precisely the peak, plateau, and decline that Tlou mentioned in his presentation, so the PPD. So if you would like to go and understand the numbers, they're on a slide that Tlou's recently showed us, but they are also part of that National Climate Change Response Policy. The perceptive amongst you, and there's already been a comment about this, is that the target for our national greenhouse gas emissions trajectory is pretty wide. It's about a 300 gigaton target. So it's fairly easy for us to hit what we say we are going to do. The question is, how are we going to bring that target down over time and achieve the levels of mitigation that the country reasonably needs to contribute in the international context? And so there are a couple of other components, other mechanisms within the mitigation system that are relevant for that. The first one, which I'm not going to discuss in any great detail because as far as I understand, it's still very much up for debate, is the idea of sectoral emissions targets. But very briefly, a set is the notion that a government department itself, so a government department other than environmental affairs, is responsible for a level of mitigation within its particular sector. Let's leave that for the moment. Let's talk about the ones that are most prevalent and have caused the most, the highest level of stakeholder participation over the last decade. So carbon budgets, carbon tax, monitoring evaluation, and greenhouse gas reporting, mitigation plans and pollution prevention plans. There are a couple of reasons that I want to talk about these right now. Firstly, the law around certainly the carbon tax and monitoring evaluation is pretty settled. The National Greenhouse Gas Reporting Regulations first appeared in April 2017, and they were amended as recently as the 11th of September this year. So we are talking about a regime that is both new and evolving, but which applies already to a range of industrial scale greenhouse gas emitters. So I mention this because obligations, regulatory obligations, and the regulator's intervention around mitigation is not a theoretical construct. It is happening right now, and the reason we are looking at, if you like, a foundational stage being established through reporting or monitoring and evaluation, if you like, is because it is important for future policy that we understand precisely where we are in terms of a carbon profile in the country. Carbon budgets are the idea, if you like, that industrial scale emitters will in future be required to restrain their emissions, their greenhouse gas emissions, within a cap, failing which there will be some level of sanction applied, and I'm going to talk about that sanction. And then the last thing I'd like to talk about from this slide is the carbon tax, and I'll elaborate slightly more on the carbon tax on the next slide. But the carbon tax is another really important illustration of the fact that while we have been talking about regulatory intervention for more than a decade, it is now with us. The carbon tax came into operation on the 1st of June 2019, and this month we are right in the midst now of the very first period for filing of carbon tax returns. It opened on the 1st of October and it will close, if you want to be precise, at 3 o'clock on the 29th of October. Carbon tax, carbon budgets, and monitoring evaluation are designed specifically to speak to one another, and I shall mention that shortly. I'd like to make one more point. At the moment, we have another really important element, another tool in government's hand, which is the objective of which is to drive towards greater levels of mitigation in the country. So at the moment, that tool is called a pollution prevention plan. In due time and under a future Climate Change Act, that will become a greenhouse gas mitigation plan. And we will see a migration of the regulatory regime that is primarily established for the management of air quality. So the legal regime under the Air Quality Act, we will see that migrate to be administered under the auspices of the future Climate Change Act. So there will be ultimately, from a legal and from a lawyer's perspective, a scenario where climate change will be managed and administered under a specific Environmental Management Act, or a SEMA, if you are familiar with the nomenclature used within government, and a range of other regulatory instruments will be enacted under the auspices or under the aegis of the Climate Change Act, including carbon budget regulations, greenhouse gas mitigation plan regulations, and the like. So now my last slide, please, Neville. So what this relationship, a very direct relationship between carbon tax, carbon budgets, greenhouse gas reporting, and pollution prevention plans. Precisely what that relationship is difficult to determine at the moment. And so I've represented that relationship as 3 intersecting circles. While there will definitely be overlap between each of these legal regimes, and let's be clear, they are separate legal regimes in their own right, it still remains to be seen how government is going to tease out the relationship, the detail of the relationship, for example, between a carbon tax and a carbon budget. Suffice to say for the moment that we anticipate that the carbon tax ultimately will become the compliance mechanism for a carbon budget. So let me explain that as my last intervention. So if I'm an industrial scale emitter, what I can anticipate in the future is that based on my greenhouse gas reporting, so based on my historical reporting, I will be allocated, so for the lawyers out there, the verb that appears in the climate change bill is allocation. The department will allocate a budget to entities that are conducting listed activities that give rise to greenhouse gas emissions. If you are already familiar with the way the carbon tax works and how the greenhouse gas reporting regulations work, you will notice a familiarity there in that terminology. So both carbon tax and reporting currently work on the basis of listed activities that give rise to greenhouse gas emissions, and a similar approach is anticipated to be used for carbon budgets. If I'm an industrial scale emitter, I will be allocated a budget by government based on my historical emissions. That means I will have a cap above which, from a regulatory perspective, I should avoid emitting. And in the event that I exceed my regulatory cap, I will be taxed at a punitive rate on the exceedance of my budget. So last and very important point. There's a question that's been asked over a number of times over a number of years is then, what happens if I'm allocated a carbon budget? Is that some sort of free allocation? Am I entitled to emit that without any consequence until I reach my budget? And the answer to that is no. The carbon tax at the existing base rate, which for the moment, by the way, for the current filing period is 120 Rand, but for this calendar year is already 127 Rand per ton. I will be taxed at the base rate for my emissions up to the extent of my carbon budget, and thereafter, as far as we understand, government's intention is to use the carbon tax at a punitive rate to seek to reduce and bring down greenhouse gas emissions. So a very important and a very interesting and complicated but quite elegant market and financial mechanism that government is seeking to impose as one of the mechanisms to achieve the country's mitigation outcomes. So Neville, thank you very much. I will leave it there.
Thank you very much, Andrew. There are still quite a lot of questions that are coming up, and I certainly have a whole lot of them myself. I'm going to try and reserve my observations to the end on these really fascinating stuff, but I don't want to lose the flow. So we've kind of had a sense of the origins and the policies that have developed in the government. We've had a look at some of the actual practical applications of this policy in legislation with some very interesting examples. And while I understand that this policy and legislation is in the process of growing, developing, and evolving, there has been litigation which matters in terms of some of this legislation and related legislation. And so our last contributor is Marcia. Marcia Davids. She's doing a PhD in law currently, but a practicing lawyer, and her research in her PhD focuses on South African climate change international commitments. She has since left the public sector after 14 years. In that role, she advised the Minister of Environmental Affairs on appeals, and she specializes in environmental, mining, administrative, and constitutional law. And Marcia, please take the floor, and looking forward to your inputs here. Thank you. You have to unmute. You're still muted. Gotcha. Okay.
Thank you so much, Neville. Thank you for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be amongst 80 great minds. As introduced by Neville, my presentation will focus on South Africa's climate change litigation. In doing so, I will touch on two critical cases that have shaped and continue to shape environmental law and hopefully shape the much proposed Climate Change Act. The first discussion will be on Tlou decision, often referred as South Africa's first climate change litigation. And the second discussion will be on Philippine horticultural area. And in order to achieve this, I will take you through three phases. Firstly, I will take you through the application process. Then I will take you through the internal appeal process. Finally, I will take you through the review process. Next slide. With regard to Tlou environmental authorization application, this is a project by New Shelf Company. They lodged an application for an EA with the Department of Environmental Affairs National Government. The application was for the establishment of a 1,200 megawatt coal-fired power station in Lephalale Municipality, Limpopo Province. What I want to emphasize here, what was done is there was a lot of work that was done in this project. So during the scoping phase, 5 alternative sites were identified in this project, and Farm Onbelek was identified as the preferred alternative site, and it was deemed to be the most technically feasible site for this project. So two decisions were made in this project. So on the 25th of February, the chief director within the department issued an environmental authorization. And a few weeks later, in 17th of March, that EA was amended. Next slide. Upon the granting of the environmental authorizations, there was an appeal. So what this meant was there was initial appeal on the initial EA, which was granted by the department by LVP attorneys, and that appeal was dismissed on the 12th of September 2015. And there was a second appeal by the Center of Environmental Rights, and they were representing the EarthLife Johannesburg and against so the appeal against Amendment EA in this regard. The main thing that actually we're laboring on within the grounds of appeal was that the department failed to take account international and national obligations to mitigate against climate change before making that decision to grant the EA. And what they labored on, it was the most critical section in NEMA, the section 24.0, which actually says that NEMA obliges the competent authority to take account of all relevant factors in deciding on an application for an EA, including any pollution, environmental impacts, environmental degradation likely to be caused by the application if it's refused or approved. Just go back a bit, one more slide back, a bit, Neville. Okay, no, we can continue. Next slide. So upon appealing, the minister looked at the appeal, and she actually thought by it like we actually made commitments internationally. So this appeal is actually groundbreaking, and they're correct. So in my decision, I'm going to dismiss the appeal. However, I'm going to call for the climate change impact assessment report. Next slide.
I'm on the review slide.
Yeah,
you want me to be
okay.
on this slide?
No, that's fine. You are correct. Okay, so upon the appeal decision, there was a review that was launched in the North Gauteng High Court. And it was a landmark ruling because it was one of the first climate change litigation that was launched in the country. So on the 8th of March, so the North Gauteng High Court handed down the judgment. And the court indicated that AtLife Africa Johannesburg was correct in claiming that the minister should have considered the power station climate change impact before granting the EA. And the court also held that in the absence of express provision in the statute requiring a climate change impact does not entail that there's no legal duty to consider climate change as a relevant consideration. So the court remitted back the EA to the minister and ordered that the EA be suspended until the minister makes a decision after considering the climate change impact assessment report. So the climate change impact assessment report was submitted to the department during the appeal period. It was peer reviewed independently. And on the 30th of January, the minister dismissed the appeal upon looking at the peer review recommendations. And now they took the minister back to court after that decision. It went on review. Next slide. So what does this judgment mean for South Africa? It means that each project, climate change and other environmental impacts must be individually assessed, and then the environmental authority must independently exercise its discretion on whether not to allow the project or to allow it to go ahead. Applications of this nature need to be accompanied by the climate change impact assessment report. So this judgment set precedent for projects such as these. When you make an application, the applicant must know, they must actually have the environmental impact assessment report accompanied by the climate change impact assessment report as a specialist study. So going forward, that's what it means for such projects. And another thing is the EIA assessment of the climate change impacts must not simply be a quantification of the project's greenhouse emissions. It must also include assessments of a broader climate change like water scarcity and health. And what this judgment also means is that the environmental authority must determine which of any, if there's many measures that require to reduce emissions and to ensure the resilience of the project and to the surrounding environment to those impacts. So this judgment had an impact on other projects which were already approved, like Key Power and Colenso and Kanyisa coal-fired power stations were actually halted by this judgment. And the applicant had to reconsider the initial applications on now going and bringing the climate change impact assessment reports to the department to be assessed before the project can go ahead. So it's a very landmark case, which it will actually have, it will inform the climate change bill going forward, I believe. Next slide. The next case is Philippi horticultural area. It was a very nice project, this one, which it actually was going to benefit the greater community. It was a proposed Auckland City project comprising of 30,000 housing units, private school, malls, and urban development. Was said to be built close to 500 hectares of land in the Western Cape. And the Department of Environmental Affairs, the development in the Western Cape, granted the environmental authorization for this project. And there was another application that was done to the city of Cape Town for the rezoning of the land. It was rezoned to be a mixed use development and associated infrastructure. Next slide. However, upon the granting of the EA and the approval of the rezoning application, there was an appeal. The decision of the EA was appealed by the PHA, and most of the ground of appeal was actually one of those that were talking to climate change. It was saying that development will negatively impact on the underground supply. So there was an aquifer where this project was earmarked. And now that had to be thought through. So the development was not thought through. It was a great development. However, there was no measures that were done to mitigate against climate change. In this regard, there was the appeals were lost, but the appeals were dismissed. Next slide. Then there was a review in terms of Rule 53 to the High Court in Cape Town, where the provincial government was taken to court to stop the project. It was like the community was actually named as in halting this development, and they don't want it to go through. And they were saying, no, we don't want, not that we don't want it to go through, it's just that there were other things that you were not considered when you planned for this project, and the climate change and the water scarcity, and there's an aquifer, so fix that before the project can go ahead. So that the judge agreed with the PHA and indicated that the potential negative impacts on underground water were not considered. And the court ordered that the MEC must think through this project in light of the climate change effects, and the court ordered that the construction of Auckland City be suspended and the EA must be reviewed. So the matter was remitted back to the department to be looked at afresh. So the court's emphasis was that the decision makers must look into the bigger picture in the future, and that the bigger picture is definitely, it includes climate change. So it goes back to that section 24.0, that you must look at the impact that might be there when you plan for such projects. That's the end of me. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Marcia. Folks, we are on, just on after 5 o'clock. We have scheduled to go on until 5:30. So I ask all of you to hang in. There are quite a few questions, and I've asked Dr. Oscar Mokotedi to handle these. Some of the questions come from me, but I will leave it to Oscar to decide whether mine make the cut or not. Oscar. So Oscar, you have the floor, and please share some of those questions. And then I just want to say that at the end of this meeting, we will discuss how to take this particular discussion forward, because I know there's a lot of interest in it. Please, Oscar.
Thanks, Neville. I think the 14th question just came through. The first question was from Dalit Enstay, and this is the question that Andrew suggested that we should revisit during this session. The question reads, do the speakers think a principled and consolidated approach to climate change is preferable over various policies across different industries and government departments?
So if I may, I'm quite interested in the question, but I will also defer to my colleagues on this. So there are a couple of things to say initially. So thanks very much for the question. Initially, so the question assumes, or seems to assume, that there is a difference between a consolidated and principled approach and one that is across sectors. We don't, simply put, we do not have the luxury to have one or the other. We have to have a consolidated and principled approach that is also implemented across sectors. The question, though, is how do you achieve that? Particularly in the context where we understand that we have possibly fractured government, and by the way, notwithstanding the fact that, Chapter 3 of the Constitution requires cooperative governance and the like. Now, for many years, and in a number of fora, there has been a lot of discussion around the idea of some sort of supra government department that will have influence across government, so horizontally across government, and not within its own silo. we have that thing in South Africa. It's called the presidency. Yes, I suspect that a number of you might be rolling your eyes and going, well, we've seen the presidency, we've seen the NDP, things seem not to be moving particularly fast in that regard, and perhaps asking a fairly legitimate question about how coherence and cohesiveness can be achieved. And my response to you is, you're right to some degree, but we're also seeing an evolution. We are seeing a stepwise process that I think is getting us to that place. The most recent indicator of that stepwise process is the release of the terms of reference for the Presidential Climate Change Consultative Committee. And I would like in this response, perhaps just to touch on one of the other questions. So the P4C is a mechanism within the presidency mandated by the climate change bill, the purpose of which will be to provide coherence, if you like, to climate governance across government, and also coherence to how that climate governance is communicated. And the P4C is not only for government, it is also for civil society, academia, and the private sector, very importantly so. So the pithy answer is, I don't think there's a choice between the principled approach. I think we have to have a principled approach that is implemented in a consolidated and cohesive fashion across all sectors in government. I'd be very curious to hear my colleagues' response, please.
Thank you, Andrew. And Andrew, I agree with you in terms of having a principled, coordinated approach. You cannot have one over the other, because the principle should underpin that coordinated approach. And we are trying to strengthen that coordinated approach through, among other things, the climate change bill. When that bill becomes an act, there's a clear institutional mechanism that will enhance the coherence of climate change response. There's also very clear roles and responsibilities across the different spheres of government that will underpin that coherence that we are talking about. So I agree with you fully. And in that institutional mechanism, you have spoken about the P4C, there's IMC, there's provincial structure, there's district, local structures that will bring all key role players together. So we cannot choose one over the other. The coherence and coordinated approach has to be based on principles, so that all the policies and measures that are implemented are underpinned by those principles. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Tlou.
Okay, may I pick up another question? Or Marcia, would you like to add to that?
No.
Okay. Here's a question from Libona Mohali. Financial implications have proven not to be much of a deterrence mechanism for environmental law and policy breaches. What more can be inculcated in the punitive and mitigation policies of the country? Now, this question came just after Andrew's presentation or during Andrew's
private colleagues.
Yeah. No, I can start, but it will be interesting to hear lawyers as to how this can be resolved, because what underpin the response in the main is polluter pay principle. That will ensure that whoever commit or whoever pollutes will have a responsibility of addressing the challenges that are associated with that payment. But I will also be interested to hear from lawyers if there is any other innovative thinking that we might have to look into this process. Hence, these conversations are important.
Marcia, your thought?
I'll wait to hear from you, Andrew. Let me just, because I'm looking at the top.
No. Sure. So, all right, again, so let's examine the basis of the question. Financial implications have proven not to be much of a deterrence for environmental law. So that's a fairly broad statement, and it's true in some respects and not so true in others. So I will respond in two different ways. The financial mechanisms that we are seeing in the country at the moment are financial mechanisms around carbon pricing. And there is substantial evidence that carbon pricing is working, not absolutely brilliantly, not entirely efficiently, but it is working in certain jurisdictions, particularly in the European Union, as a matter of interest. And I will acknowledge that there is contrary information that comes out of the EU around implementation of the European Union emissions trading scheme, but certainly the EU Commission has put its faith in emissions trading as one of, this is important, one of the mechanisms by which to drive a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So I suppose the first response to that question is that financial mechanisms are but one of the tools within government's hands. Here's my intermediate response. Interestingly enough, in the early days of the carbon taxes development, when more direct and less complicated by simply saying the carbon tax is thus, and if you're an emitter, you shall pay it, the response from industry was to say, no, you as government need to give us as industry a range of options so that we can control our own fate. Give us, in essence, a series of mechanisms, financial and other mechanisms, that will allow us both to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and to control our exposure to the carbon tax. So we now have a carbon tax legal regime that is really complicated because of a discussion, a long-term discussion, nearly 15 years of discussion that went on between government and emitters around the difference between, if you like, a command and control, a much more, a mechanism that was much more, that leaned further towards command and control than it does now. Having said that, financial mechanisms cannot be the only way that we seek to achieve and implement a national climate change response. And so your traditional command and control mechanisms are vitally important. May I point out that if you go and look at the gazetted climate change bill, you will see that the standard penalty under the National Environmental Management Act, which is 5 years, 5 million rand, 10 years, or 10 million rand as a penalty, is proposed as a compliance mechanism within the context of climate change law. I understand that that might be becoming less prevalent within more recent iterations of the bill. But it is essential that climate regulation, legislation and regulation in the future is a combination of these, command and control and financial mechanisms.
Thanks for that, Andrew. Tlou, here's one for you from Alex Lenferner. Mr. Ramaru mentions that South Africa's GHG emissions reduction agreed to under the Paris Agreement were informed by our fair share. However, according to many analysts, our emissions pathway is highly insufficient and much weaker than our fair share. How can we still claim that we are doing our fair share? And yeah, there's a link to back up that question.
Thanks, Oscar. I think our fair share has to be interpreted within the principle of equity in the United Nations Framework Convention to combat a Convention on Climate Change. And when you talk equity, you are looking in terms of what is it that we can do as a country in relations to our capacity, in relation to the resources. But again, what are the other countries' responsibilities towards us achieving the objective or the target that we have set for ourselves? Here is a point. When you look in terms of remember we are responding here to the global emission. We are responding to the effect of the global emission. Emissions knows no bound. When you look at the historical responsibility, you would agree with me that there are countries that have a huge responsibility who can support in the main developing countries such as us as a country, South Africa, who can be able to respond, who can be able to adapt to the effect of climate change. So it should be interpreted within that context. Otherwise, we will also be pressed to say you are not doing enough. We hear that often. But again, in terms of our trajectory, we are very clear in terms of the PPD, the peak plateau decline, and we are tracking that. We're still within the PPD, and that is the policy that is guiding us in terms of our international commitment.
Thanks, Tlou. Marcia, here's one for you from Neville. Does the minister have the right to make a decision once the climate change impact assessment report has been produced, no matter what it says?
Thank you so much for that. The minister actually in Kabamete required the experts' recommendation on the climate change impact assessment report. I think that's why the question is posed. And she's entitled to do that in terms of Regulation 6 of the appeal regulations. So what its recommendations made to her. So she can either take the recommendations or not, no matter what the study says. So she says, I want you to tell me what my implications are, but you're making recommendations to me. I make the final decision on what you tell me. So yes, she can, it's a decision and she's willing to fall on the sword for that. So that's what we were faced with in Kabamete decision. So yes, it's a minister's decision, recommendations are done, it's a final word, no matter what the studies say.
Chairman's prerogative, Oscar. I want to just follow that up. So that means that if the recommendations are don't proceed with this particular development because of the climate change implications, the minister can still decide to proceed. The risk for her or him is that they will that the decision to proceed despite the recommendations can be reviewed in a court, and the court can file against the minister.
Yeah, that's what happened in Kabamete. She did exactly that. There were damning findings in the climate change recommendations that were made to her. And then despite that, she said, you know, this is a priority project. I've looked at what the recommendations are saying. But at the end of the day, I'm going to make a decision, and this is my decision. That decision was taken on review again. So remember, we went on review initially on the amended EA. It was remitted back to her. She had to consider the climate change impact assessment report. She did that, and she got external person to peer review the study. And then after she made a decision, she was taken back on review because of that. So yeah, she will have to stand by her word when she's called in, probably at the court, to say you made this decision despite what the report is saying. What was your reason? She has to answer to that.
Thanks, Marcia.
Neville, could I pick up a point just from that? And it relates to the question, which is, there's a question about a mandate for civil society, possibly within the context of the climate change bill. So two comments about that, and absolutely picking up from what Marcia just said. First of all, you wouldn't expect a statute, a national statute, to prescribe or to provide a mandate for civil society, because government is not in the business of governing how civil society operates. However, and this is really important, and it's demonstrated by Thaba Metsi and what Marcia has just said, civil society in this country over the last 20 years, from Save the Vaal judgment onwards, has been fundamental in driving where we are now in terms of environmental governance. Yes, it is not perfect. It is a work in progress, but without the levels of attention, aggression, litigious ability that we've seen from civil society, we wouldn't be seeing the level of balance, or the level of balanced viewpoint that we are seeing being applied in environmental decisions. And Thabametsi is a perfect example of that. It's an example of where the role of civil society has been pivotal. It just happens to have been pivotal in a climate change context.
Thank you very much for that, Marcia. And I would like to hand over to Neville now, in the interest of time, to wrap up the session, and then maybe we'll finish up with one or two of the remaining questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Oscar, Laduma is around. I need you to unmute Laduma. You can unmute yourself when you are ready to. I want to close off this meeting by saying there's a whole lot of other questions that have been asked that we haven't managed to answer. And I have a plan for that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to meet with my 3 colleagues here and we'll go through those questions and record that session at your convenience, but not at legal rates, definitely. And then I will append the answers to those questions to the video of this event, and then it'll be a package. So at least we'll get through that stuff and people can go to those particular questions. So Oscar, thank you very much for stepping in so late in the day to help us with the session, and I hope that you will join us in the future to do this for us. And then finally, I want to say, folks, this has been a scratch of the surface. Very clearly, when you open a new box, especially for me, who is not a legal person, but more in the world of research and science, there's clearly a huge amount of information and knowledge that we need to investigate and interrogate, not so much as legal practitioners, but in fact as either citizens or people whose work is meant to inform policy, ultimately, policy and legislation. One of the questions I do want to ask is how we explore this relationship further. Where are the legislative gaps that need more science, and where does the science need more policy guidance, for example? So I foresee further sessions on this topic or this particular domain of work. So I'm going to say thank you all very, very much for your contributions. It's been a really important and insightful and valuable kickoff for us. And I invite all of you to please watch announcements about other events, which will follow on later on. Finally, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Laduma Matwane to say two more words before we close out for the day. And the speakers, you can hang around for a post-mortem afterwards if you like. Okay, thanks. Laduma.
Thanks, Neville, and your panelists, and also Oscar there for managing the chat box. And apologies for not being able to link up as early as possible and not being able to share with you what I would have wanted to share with you. More importantly, that my colleague from Environmental Affairs, Tlou, has shared some of the things that I might have touched on. But having said that, I just have a couple of things just to share with you as that relates to our role and contribution to climate change policy discourse, or as you call it. And secondly, just to share with you the policy development on our side from science, technology, and innovation space, so that we know where we are going and our interface with climate change policy discourse, and how we support the broader environmental protection and sustainability. So those will be the two things that I just want to share with you. Firstly, I just want to caution or alert everyone that you might be aware that we are no longer called Department of Science and Technology. We are Department of Science and Innovation. So that's in itself is an added mandate to us. There is an innovation component that we need to deal with. So hence the department now called Department of Science and Innovation. We share the same minister with the Department of Higher Education and Training, for those that may not be aware. So there is a need there for the two departments to work closely together. So that's On the mandate side, as you all know that we are a policy and strategy department, and our primary role is to manage and coordinate the national system of innovation and to make sure that we mobilize resources for the system. And lastly, we do monitoring and evaluation of programs and review of programs that we will have implemented over a period of time. So those would be some of the functions that we do. As we have a couple of entities that actually give effect to our policy instruments, TIA, we have CSI, NRF, and so forth. So I think the point that I want to stress now, one of the few points is on how we interface with the climate change policy discourse. And I'm aware that, in fact, I want to stress that there's no confusion or policy overreach when it comes to the coordination of climate change in South Africa, okay? The Department of Environmental Affairs, Tourism and Fisheries is responsible for coordination of climate change policy or work, and we provide support, science, technology, and innovation support to that mandate, as well as other departments that we provide support. So I think the point that I can highlight in terms of the support that we provide to Department of Environmental Affairs and Fisheries, Tourism and Department of Environmental Affairs, Fisheries and Forestry. I won't get it wrong. Yes, for example, we work together on the national climate change adaptation strategy. I think Tlou did talk about that, and also on the mitigation side. So we provided science and support to that work, okay, as evidence that's required to inform the policies that they develop. So that's the kind of work that we do with them. So on our side, we do have our own plans that focus on broader environmental sustainability. We have a program called Global Change Crane Challenge. Some of you might be aware of this, or everyone is at least now aware of the Global Change Crane Challenge. So under that, we have a specific research program or plan that outlines how we support research in various elements of global change. So that's the Global Change Research Plan. So we give effect to that through a number of programs, Access being one of them, and initiatives. There are programs and initiatives that give effect to the plan that we have. So I also want to highlight the fact that the department also plays a strategic role in support of the National Development Plan. So there is in the section 5, I think, in the National Development Plan that talks about the importance of science and technology in a transition to low carbon economy and resilience, climate resilience society. So science and technology is viewed as very important, and under that theme, we are responsible for 2 actions. One being to compile what we call biennial reports to cabinet on the state of climate change, science and technology in South Africa. That's something that we do biennially. The second thing that, which is the theme of today's event, is around coordinating a functional national climate change research network, which we are building around Access to be able to draw on the research that is being done in that network. So that's one of the things that are linked directly to National Development Plan. So recently, you might be aware that we have undergone policy change. There's a new white paper on science, technology, and innovation that was adopted, or that was signed in 2019. So that formalizes the adoption of innovation as another component that becomes our responsibility as a department. So that white paper on science and technology will be implemented through a 10-year decadal plan. So we are currently developing the first decadal plan to implement the objects of the white paper. So that the decadal plan will start from 2021 for a period of 10 years. So we are currently busy with finalizing that or working on that. So what I can give you as an assurance is the fact that we don't anticipate changes, okay, to the climate change work program that we all know, okay. There is a principal decision that some elements of the climate change current challenge will be retained within the new arrangement under the new decadal plan. Whether that will still be climate change mission area or something else, but then the major elements of the work that we are currently funding as a department under climate change current challenge will still be retained, but maybe in a different form, okay? That's the one thing that I need to highlight. And also to highlight the fact that the implication of a new policy direction has the implication of that would be on institutional landscape, because some of the entities that report to DSI directly, okay, we might see new entities being brought in as part of the institutional landscape, okay. We might also see the increased mandate or expanded mandate of some of these entities that report to us as a result of the policy change. So those are some of the points that I wanted to share with you. The last point I want to share with you is why are we supporting access, okay? Access is one of our strategic programs, climate change programs. So with a special focus in F-system science, as you all know, so F-system science being one of the major elements of the climate change research plan. So that's the reason why we are supporting access. We will continue supporting access. The second reason why we support access, or we are partnering with access in a number of things, is access ability to bring in role players into the research domain. So we are using access as a virtual network of collaborating partners to build a stronger research network around climate change. So that's why we are continuing working with access and giving or opening doors for access to work with other sister departments, even regionally and continentally. So those are the few things that I wanted to share with you, and a lot has been covered, and Tlou, my colleague, did touch on a number of things, so I don't need to repeat some of those things. So I think I thank you for the platform to share this.
Thank you very much, Duma.
Okay.
Thanks very much for that. I've got you on record now, and I'll just play it back every time we have a meeting. So.
Yes.
And when I come back to you for funding, I'll play it back again. Okay, so folks, that is where we're going to officially stop today's proceedings. Thanks again to everybody and those that have hung out until the end. And I'm going to call it complete and done, and suggest that if you want to stay on the panel, guys, just to chat for a little bit before we go have dinner, then we can do that. Otherwise, the rest of you are all welcome to leave. So that's it. We're done. Thank you.
Thank you, Neville.